Tony. Welcome to the People in Housing podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming along. Hope you found our new office
Brilliant.
good.
Lovely.
So for the benefit of the audience, for those who don't know who you are, can you give us a quick introduction in terms of your current role and what you do within social housing?
Yes, so I'm Tony Clark. I've been in the social housing sector since, dare I say it, 1981. So a long time now. July of last year, I took on the role as Midlands Regional Director for Seddon Construction Limited. We're a smaller region, if you like, staff-wise compared to Northwest, but we do oversee all main work streams that the business delivers, so new build, planned maintenance, decarbonisation. So I have a team that looks after all of those.
So as Regional Director, for those who don't know much about Seddon, because obviously people who watch our podcast are we allowed to say the dark side? I've already said it within 3 minutes. What kind of, how big is your operation within the region in terms of headcount, turnover?
At the moment, we've got probably just short of 30 directly employed individuals in various roles. We are fairly autonomous as a region. We rely upon our Northwest colleagues for estimating and bid writing and that kind of thing. But we've got the front end of delivery. So I've got contracts managers, I've got partnerships managers in terms of business development, and we've got a commercial team there as well for the financial side of things. Turnover currently is about 20 million, which is dwarfed by our Northwest colleagues. But you know, Seddon, if you look at their history, they've been going 128 years and they are Northwest based, so they've got a real head start on the rest of us. Ambition-wise, next 3 years, we want to take 20 to at least 50. The Midlands, and it's both East and West, by the way, not just the West Midlands, which some people seem to think it is. For me anyway, I think it's an untapped area for the business. I'm knocking on doors of people that I've known for a long time, and they think we do painting, which we do, but we do far more. Oh, I didn't know that. Or you're Novus. We're not Novus, that's a different company entirely. So the first 6 to 12 months of my role is very much about marketing, branding, awareness raising, and you know, delivering some work, but hopefully delivering it to the quality that we need it to be, and then people will pick up from there.
Cool. And obviously knowing and stalking you from afar, obviously you've worked for a range of regional associations that have got 4,000 or 5,000 units. You've worked for national associations who are some of the biggest in the country. Obviously, this podcast is going to be the first one of its kind in terms of someone who's transitioned from client side to the contracting side. So can you just talk us through, say, that transition in terms of over the last 10 years, how you've gone from, because not many people make that transition. You know, can you talk us through, you know, the last 15 years in terms of, you know, the exposure that you, because obviously from a housing background and then got into asset management, just how has that helped you in the new role?
I guess there's two main themes to that. So one is that, you know, and you'll know yourself, Dal, as you get older and your career progresses, you move away from being a specialist in any particular field, you become more of a general manager. Then your job becomes much more around relationships, vision, politics, budgets, finance, you know, clearing the decks, as we talked about before, for other people to come along and to develop the team and so on. So that's been a big part of my last 15 years, is just getting from where I was to where I am now. I mean, I was an exec director at 34, so I've spent the last 25 years, you know, in senior roles. And although I'm not technically qualified in property, so I'm not a QS, I'm not a building surveyor, right from very early on in my career, I've managed asset management teams, I've managed construction teams, I've managed a whole host of various services. But on the property side, I've managed a lot of the teams that are on the receiving end of the contractor market, but with enough knowledge to know how to run a property service. So when I got the call last year, and I was looking to move on after 5 years with Orbit, it wouldn't have been my first choice, in the sense that I'd not consciously gone out. And you'll hear the phrase time and time again, people fall into housing. It almost feels like I've fallen into the contractor market. But when I sat down and I thought about what was on offer, housing associations, local authorities are really under the cosh these days. Huge amount of challenge. It just felt right. I wanted to do something, if you like, on the other side and try and influence from the contractor perspective. And so far, that's working really well.
And to delve deeper into that, at what point what happened where you thought, you know what, I've done client side for years, and obviously, you know, people fall into housing. I totally get that. People fall into recruitment. At what point was it where you thought, you know what, I'm going to go to work for a big regional or national contractor?
The last 2 years at Orbit, given that it is so many years that I've worked in the sector, it's probably the hardest couple of years in my career. And you speak to anybody on the housing side, and they'll probably say the same for those that have been around, 10, 20, 30 years. Huge amounts of pressure, in terms of the need for new homes, damp and mould. Sadly, the little boy that lost his life in Rochdale. Regulatory pressures, and suddenly it became a real cauldron of challenge. And part of the solution to some of those issues is about better collaboration with the contractor market. And it just felt right. Don't get me wrong, I've had good relationships with the contractor market for a number of years, but there's been nothing like, my eyes have been really opened in that sort of 6 to 8 months since I joined the business. But it was and I didn't just choose the contractor market. I have to be sort of careful here, I chose Seddon. Not that I have anything about, the other tier one players in the contractor market, but Seddon from a values perspective, because it's family owned, 4th generation, very strong values, very strong social value culture, probably was about as close to a housing association as you can get in the way that, I've been used to things. So it just felt the right fit.
Yeah, that makes sense. And obviously, different pros and cons going to a big PLC business. And obviously pros and cons working for a very well-known brand. What's been the top 2 challenges? Because if you could say, I didn't expect that coming, even though I've worked at a very senior exec level. What's been the top 2 challenges that you faced?
I don't know whether they're challenges, but things that have opened my eyes. Jokingly, I've had to learn a whole new language. People talk about the housing world being full of acronyms and short words for things, but it's the same in the contractor market. I think the serious things are that the one big thing that stood out for me is that margins on a lot of our work is incredibly tight. So this idea on the housing side that contractors are just out to make money and there's profit in everything that we do, actually far from it. I think that's a challenge, in so much as I genuinely want to help the housing sector get to where it wants to be. I can't do it on a shoestring.
Nope.
I need to make a margin to give you the quality that you need. So I think that was one big takeaway. And then I think the other side of it has just been about the complexity of mobilising a £40,000 job. Is no different to the complexity of mobilising a £3 million, £5 million job as well. So an awful lot of governance and mobilisation has to go into those things to make it work the way you want to make it work.
And do you think that you could have made that transition 10 years ago, or is there a time served where you think, right, I'm glad I did it at this time of where I'm at in my career?
As I say, it's different, isn't it, for different people? So I've been very lucky in my career that I was an exec director in my early 30s. So I already had, by the time I hit 50, a good 15 years under my belt of working in, senior positions, all the governance that goes with that, the strategies that need to be developed. So from a general manager's perspective, I probably could have made that move 10 years ago. But the last 5 years working at Orbit, and I was Orbit's Director of Property Operations, I managed everything from reactive maintenance planned. I had all of the compliance work as well. That probably is really what has stood me in good stead, jumping over the fence.
And there'll be some people watching this thinking, oh, I want to make that move. I'm too scared. And shall I do it? And I've seen it over my 20 years of doing public and private sector recruitment, so I can relate to some of the things that you're saying. There's no real right time. What's your top 2 tips for someone to make that transition so they're successful?
Yeah. I think you have to be open-minded to a changing approach. Contractor market genuinely wants to do a great job. I don't see anything in any of the organisations I have relationships with that tells me otherwise, but they need to make money. They need to cover overheads and they need to produce some profit. Culturally, that's quite difficult from somebody in the housing world who looks at it the other way. What, you made a 5% profit? Oh, you know, 3%. So I remember having a conversation in my first few weeks with the business, and on one particular job, and it was quite a rarity. We were nearly up at sort of 8-9%, and I said, that's a lot. And I remember the commercial director saying to me, "Don't really want you saying that again." So I think you have to be open-minded. It is quite a different philosophy. It's a different culture. So that's one thing that I think people have to be ready for, is just embracing.
And profit isn't a dirty word.
No. You know, as I said, the margins are generally very tight anyway. So even on, you know, a few £1 million worth of work, you might only be making, you know, £25,000-30,000. I think people would be surprised by that. But you have to be open to recognising these are commercial entities. And unlike the housing sector, where your rental income is more or less guaranteed, you know, from a tenant payment basis, you've got to find your work in this sector. I think the other thing that people ideally, you know, do need to try and do is get some experience in different parts of what we call property, as I've managed to do. As I say, I was lucky that it was part of my role, but you know, working in planned maintenance is very different to working in decarbonisation. It's different again from working in, you know, new build. So if anybody, you know, wants to take that particular route, probably if they could get themselves some sort of job shadowing or placements, job swaps, a bit of time in each of those, you know, work streams, I think that would be very helpful.
And is there anything in terms of perception? Has your perception changed on anything going to the private sector? Bar the margin, how tight the margin's been?
Well, I can only speak for Seddon.
Of course.
I think you know that's all that I know. I suppose I've been surprised that, you know, a lot of the organisations out there do want to do a great job. That feels a bit awkward saying that. You know, the perception on the housing side, certainly in my early career, was that, you know, everybody was out to, you know, get one over of us, make significant profits, and you know, best job, and then, you know, gone. You won't see me again. I'm seeing a lot of people taking real care about what they want to do, about giving something back as well in terms of social value. So, yeah, it's just it's changed the way that I see the contractor market generally.
And what would be just say, let's make it up, tomorrow you move back to public sector, what would be the top 2 learns that you would take from the private sector and then embed it into working in the public sector to re-educate your peers, having worked both sides of the fence?
I think one of the significant ones for me is that there is a way to collaborate and a way not to collaborate. There are still organisations out there that are putting jobs out to market, which is single stage design and build. You've got no place for negotiation. You've got no place for improving the specification in the first place. And quite often it's a race to the bottom line. And, you know, I kind of get why some people would want to go down that route. But the reality is, ultimately, I don't think you're going to get the best outcome if that's the route that you want to take. So for me, I think, you know, one of the things that I'd be back on the other side trying to re-educate my colleagues to do is, if you want a quality job, if you want some comeback, you want warranty, look, let's have a proper conversation with these guys, and let's be open to their ideas about how we might go about doing that. I think that's one thing that I would certainly you know, seek to bring in. I think the other thing, and you know, poach a term, gatekeeper, and back again. I'd probably be more challenging contractors that were coming to my table saying, "Oh, I can't make this job work." I'd be like, "Okay, fine, let's have a look at your prelims," you So it's worked both ways, really. I think I could help the housing sector understand the contractor market more, but equally I could represent the housing sector better, knowing what I now know about how contractors price work, mobilise work.
And how do you, I mean, you've mentioned social value, and obviously we also do a lot of bids ourselves.
Yeah.
And the percentage of social value is increasing now, and rightly so. Talk us through how you think that's going to evolve over the next 1 or 2, 3 years in terms of partnership and having true social value.
It is vitally important, not just from the point of view of work that you win. I think all big businesses with a lot of money in the bank, as it were, should be doing something for social value. I think where at the moment we do have a challenge is I don't think that expectations of the landlords that are commissioning our work align with what the reality is of actually sometimes how much it costs to deliver a decent social value outcome. And if you want us to deliver this menu of 15, 16 things, there might have to be a cost associated with that. But we try and do a blend of both. So from a group perspective, we invest a proportion of our profits in social value activities. We're still, given the size of the business, doing really well with apprenticeships, for example. We took on 16 apprentices this year, we had over 1,000 applicants.
Wow.
Which we're very proud of. But again, I think, and of course the Procurement Act is going to force more social value contractually through arrangements, which we've got one eye on. But again, I think it comes back to that transparent and honest conversation with landlords about, well, look, we can do all of that, but if I do that at my cost, I'm into zero profit.
Yeah.
We'd like to do it, but we'd like to build something in. It's part of the deal.
Interesting. And in terms of obviously knowing both sides of the fence, how has that helped you increase your superpowers of influencing client side now? Obviously, you've got the can't say resume. We're not in America. You've got the background in terms of your CV of working for so many big organisations. How has that helped you increase your influence?
I think if I'm talking to landlord representatives these days, and I've had the feedback so far from several organisations, they're actually finding it quite refreshing that they're talking to an ex-director from a housing association who's been through the pain that they're still going through, whether that's about damp and mould, whether it's about decarbonisation. They're talking to somebody that really understands their challenge, and certainly in terms of some of the perception work that we've done recently with clients and sort of the general sector. One of the things that comes out time and time again is we want to work with partners that know us, understand our challenge, and can bring some solutions to the table. So that's been incredibly helpful to be able to have those conversations. I think internally, I've also driven Seddon quite hard on what I consider to be important things that we need to be better at, that I now know the housing world will be asking for when it next comes to market for whatever the particular piece of work is. So I remember, in the early days of me joining, one of the bids that we were looking at asked for the sustainability action plan and how would we measure the outcomes and how would we report. And so I asked for the sustainability action plan and somebody sent me the carbon plan, which is great.
Yeah.
I said, but that's just kind of one of several things that makes up a sustainability action plan. Where's this sustainability? We've got one. So again, looking at it from the housing side of things, I'm working on a customer experience framework, I'm working on a sustainability strategy. So I'm bringing a lot more to Seddon that maybe the bigger tier ones, they do more of this stuff, and maybe we are a little bit behind the curve. I don't know, but so I'm driving that. And I think I'm also probably challenging the senior team at the moment and the board around their thinking on certain things. So, we've had quite a debate internally about whether the business gets involved in building safety work for all of the reasons that we know in terms of gateways and risk and all the stuff that goes with it. And, I have a slightly different view. I absolutely get the risk argument, but if we're not going to help, who is going to help? You know, is the market big enough to do all that needs to be done? And actually, from a commercial perspective, it is an opportunity, and it's an opportunity that maybe in 5, certainly 10 years' time, will be gone, because buildings will be fully remediated, cladding will have been replaced, and new facades put on. So I'm using it in different ways. It's a really interesting dynamic and swap.
About 17, 18 years ago, when I used to do private sector recruitment, because I moved from public sector, the contractors were very much, we only want people from a construction background, private sector only. Whereas now, in the last 8, 9, 10 years, they're all of, and rightly so, they're really open to taking people on from a public sector background, because they will obviously understand the customer base. But not enough people make that transition over. So it's very, I mean, I'm seeing more and more, but why, in your opinion, do you see not enough people coming from, not as an exec director, but even strong asset managers, strong housing management, strong social value specialists from the public sector? Why aren't more moving over to the Seddons, the Equans, the Fortums of this world, in your opinion?
I suppose there's a few things. This is just my perception. I can't say for definite, but I would imagine there are probably some on the contractor side that believe housing staff are a little bit soft underbelly.
Okay.
We don't work as hard. We don't have that kind of drive. We can't cut it, in the commercial world. And what's really interesting for me in joining Seddon, as I say, which has been around for 128 years, you kind of think they'd be at a certain place. And my MD, Peter, a couple of times he said at various meetings, he's looked at me and he said, "You're more professional than we are," which is a compliment. And what he really means by that is, I think their perception of what they thought a housing person would be, a little bit slow-paced, a little bit, laboured. The housing world has moved on significantly in the last few years, and so there are some great people, without doubt, working in housing associations. So I think that's the first thing that the contractor market really has to kind of open its eyes to, is you've got some fantastic people that can make a difference. And I think fair play to Peter, my MD, when we had the conversation about was I going to join them or not. He said, "Look, I'm not looking for another Waits, another United Living. No disrespect to those organisations," he said, "but what I know will happen is they will come in and they will try and imprint their experience on this business. We want somebody from the housing world." So that was pretty refreshing. I don't think the contractor market goes looking for people either, on the other side of the fence, as it were. Where are the platforms where those collaborative conversations take place? I can't think of many. I mean, I'm a board member of the NHMF, as you know. And we have a what we call a service provider forum sitting below that, where we've got contractors like Seddon kind of conversing alongside the housing side of things. If there were more platforms like that, more collaboration, better understanding, maybe you would start to open those floodgates a little bit more. But right now, I think there's a perception. I think maybe contractor market is not looking in that direction, and it needs 2 more.
And obviously, there's a big, and rightly so, on the private sector side, and you never hear this on public sector, which is always interesting, when they want to get more women into roles within private sector. You never see a housing association ever have that conversation. What do you think now, working on that side of the fence? Obviously there's lots of legacy challenges there. You know what I mean? So what are the contractors doing rightly now from your observations of going, well, we are going to get more women into leadership roles and more women into to basically split that ratio up? Because there's obviously lots of discussions amongst all the contractors to do that. And there has been for the last 5 years, I think, pre-pandemic. What do you think is the challenge on that? How they can solve it?
It has to start at the top, inevitably. There has to be a culture, a mission, a plan to make that change. Sadly, I look around my own senior management team at the moment and the wider team, and they are typically men, white,
yeah,
and to a degree of a certain age as well. And certainly in the few years that I've got left in my career, that is one of the things that I'm desperate to change, is to change the mix, not just from a kind of a man-woman situation, but in all kinds of diverse ways. So I think you have to have that very strong leadership. I think you have to have a goal in mind. I mean, it's ironic really when you look at the housing association market, or local authorities as well, compared to the contractor market. I'd probably hazard a guess you've got more women in senior positions on the housing side,
I think so,
than you have on the contractor side. Whether that's because that's the way the contractor market has wanted to keep things, I don't know. But if we want to make that change, then it has to come from the top.
And in terms of your experience, what from a contractor's viewpoint, what are the most common pitfalls that you've seen working with housing associations, and how can those be avoided so there's more true collaboration as opposed to supplier, customer, master servant relationship?
I'm not saying that transactional relationships can't work. They can, if it's a particular job, one-off, in, out, gone. But there are still organisations out there that behave in a transactional way. They're not looking to get into a collaborative partnership with people. I've got a budget, I need you to do this, please do it. And we don't negotiate, we don't plan, we don't jointly talk about what's needed to be achieved. I think that's a flaw in the system, if I'm honest with you. The number of bids that we pitch for, where weeks into the job, we're having to vary the scope of the work significantly because they've not, their data might be poor, or they've planned the scope wrong, or maybe the specifications wrong. But don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that they're necessarily poor in that sense. I work with a lot of small to medium-sized housing organisations, and to be fair to them, they haven't got the expertise and the sizable teams that some of the bigger players have.
And so small to medium is 1,000 to about 6,000 units.
Yeah, something like that, around about the 5,000-6,000 mark. And so, again, what I think our job should be is about trying to guide, educate, help those organisations to a better place at the outset. But if you're going to come to market with a single stage design and build, and it's all about price and it's not about quality, you're going to get what you're going to get. So that for me is a significant pitfall. Yeah, I just think unrealistic expectations. I think a lot of this is just about, if people are willing to come to the table at the outset of what's needed, you can kind of talk these things through. You might not always agree on things, but you'll understand each other's position. Yeah. Whereas I still think we're a bit too transactional in our relationships.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I mean, obviously, we've just moved and we had to appoint a refurbishment contractor, and then you hear the phrase, that's a variation on the contract, and that's a variation on the contract. But then I looked at it and thought, well, that is a variation, so we're going to have to spend more money. Yeah. But you've got to have that adult conversation, because that's true partnership.
Yeah, and I would rather, bid for a piece of work at 2 million than bid for a piece of work at 1.5 million, and then stick in £500,000 worth of, because that doesn't do the contractor market any good. I think what that suggests, which isn't necessarily the case, it's, oh, I see, so you came in with a low price and now suddenly you're going to bash us with all of these variations. Well, I'm bashing you with the variations because the scope of the project in the first place and the data that you gave me didn't allow me to give you that upfront analysis of what's really needed.
And do you have like I'm trying my best not to use a football analogy, but and obviously we're both brilliant football teams, one better than the other, allegedly. If we use like the Champions League, there's a collaboration and everyone knows, right? Do the contractors, obviously now that you're working private sector side, is there enough collaboration between all of the usual suspects to have conversations? Because there's enough work there for everyone to discuss, innovation, efficiencies. How can we get more people from public sector? Is there enough conversations where you guys meet up in terms of your peers?
In my short time with Seddon, I would say not. As I say, I talked about the NHMF Service Provider Forum. I think that particular group's now got something like 40, 50 contractors, members who meet on a quarterly basis. So that's really helpful. But that typically tends to be about a theme for the day.
Yeah.
Whether that's about social value or procurement act, for example. I'm not aware really of many platforms where you're just talking, I've got a problem, you know.
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting because the housing market was like that for a long, long time. You know, I was working for various housing associations, and would you talk to somebody else about particular? Well, no, you wouldn't, because they're a competitor.
Yeah.
You want that new build business. That's really begun to change in the housing sector. There's an awful lot of collaboration these days, driven by, you know, the NHF as their trade body, and then you've got the Chartered Institute of Housing on the professional standard side of things. I'm not aware at the moment of any sort of operational conversations that are taking place about how we could all, because you're right, that's my view. I think there is more than enough work.
Yeah, there's more than enough work for everyone
to go round. That's one of my challenges for the next 2 to 3 years. I am competing against the very big tier ones.
Yeah.
And you know, I strongly believe there is a place for, you know, SMEs such as the likes of Seddon.
100%. I think when, you know, the NHMF, Direct Works Forum, the Chick events, the Manchester one, the New Liverpool one, I think sometimes, obviously I've seen you at a few, that's where we first met, stuck in a queue having for breakfast. I think they don't send enough of the right people like yourselves down. I think some firms tend to just send the BD people down.
Yeah.
But you don't.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's the same faces, the same BDMs attending all these events. So if, you know, a rising star in your business, public or private sector background, was at said events, he or she could be networking and meeting and potentially headhunting people from that side. But the BDMs are just
you know, you go. I think Housing 2025, obviously last year, in that new form that it is now, where the NHF and the CIH have moved away to their own conference in Liverpool, it feels like a trade show. It just feels like it's just about business development, and I get that. You know, that there has to be a place for that, but that's very different to a platform where you want to talk collaboration, you want to talk shared pain. How do we get through this kind of stuff, or indeed, how do we sort of begin to help each other? So I think compared to the housing side right now, there's probably still more competition between the various players. And okay, they are commercial entities. They have to please shareholders and, you know, they have to survive. It's been a tough market, hasn't it, for contractors? Yeah. But I think we could do so much more for this country if there were collaboration, not just between contractors and contractors, but contractors and the housing side as well. You know, we're all pitching for the same issue, aren't we? You've got all those homes that are in building, all of those existing homes that need remediating. You know, this transactional way of doing things, or this kind of competitive spirit in which some people may still work, ain't going to get us there.
Yeah. And obviously, the main topic of today's podcast is more transitioning from public to private sector. Yeah. But you mentioned it a few times, and I wanted to ask your opinion on it. Obviously, I've seen over the last 10 years, there's not many now regional contractors in the Midlands market. It's kind of the super clubs, so to speak, in terms of these big corporate machines, and there's not many regional 5 to 40, 50 million pound contractors, you know, where it's a founder or it's, you know, two business partners. Do you think over the next, you know, looking into your crystal ball, do you think we're going to get that back in terms of regional contractors, where the associations will want to partner with a regional firm, or are we just kind of going towards big multi, you know, branded corporate billion-pound turnover businesses?
I think, you know, there is an intent to support SMEs. You know, you look at the Procurement Act, and, you know, it tries to drive commissioners to a place where everybody gets kind of a share of everything. It's a level playing field. But the reality is that the significant players in that space can produce the glossy brochures, can reduce the margins, can buy work, you know, if that's needed. And if you don't know where your next sort of pipeline is coming from as a regional contractor, you can very quickly find yourself without work and therefore, you know, out of business. So there's got to be proper investment regionally in keeping businesses like that going. And it's interesting, I had a conversation with, two people actually. So, you know, one individual was very, very clear with me. We are only commissioning significant tier ones. because they had a particular reason for wanting to do that, and I'm like, but I'm on your doorstep. I mean, shouldn't I have some, slice of the pie, as it were? Not because I think we should, we deserve it, but I think we can do you a good job. Yeah. But absolutely not. And then I spoke to somebody else, and they were sort of, we're a little bit fed up now with some of the big, the big conglomerates. We want some fresh faces, and actually, we do think there's a place for SMEs. So almost like a sort of a two-tier structure, as it were. But that's, at the moment, I think that's being driven by individuals and the way that they see things, not by policy.
Okay.
I'm not so sure that the Procurement Act's ambition to want to generate, business for the SME market is actually going to happen. People will find a way around that if they still favour a big tier one.
Unfortunately so.
Yeah. I mean, but again, and maybe some of us aren't well known enough. That's the other thing. As I say, I'm knocking on doors, and they either don't know us, they haven't heard of us. And these are businesses, these are organisations that are only 10 miles down the road, and they've never heard of us. It's like, so again, because you've not quite got that big budget behind you, you're not able to do all of that marketing and branding and awareness.
Yeah.
It's hard, it's hard getting out there and finding work.
Yeah, and these stands, if you're going to go and present at some of these big, I mean, I can't say on camera how much we spend, but I also know how much other firms spend. It's a big chunk of your budget to allocate to it's a lot of cash. Yeah. But then it's a whole brand awareness piece, isn't it?
Yeah. It's so easy. People would probably say naive, but you look at some of the European countries, and we do some study tours each year at the NHMF. Last year we did Sweden, Stockholm, and one or two of the European visits that we've made, they almost seem to have very long-term strategies that are multi-government, if you like. Whether you're red, whether you're blue, whether you're another colour, that policy will continue. And I think, again, that's what's missing in this country. We're very short term in terms of our planning. Yeah. So everybody's kind of fighting for that scarce resource because they think, well, in 5 years' time, it might be gone and something else could come along. It's a difficult market in which to operate. And yet there is so much need. Yeah. You would like to think, as you said before, there's work for everybody.
Cool. It pains me to mention Man City. It really does, but I'm going to mention them in a question. So, the treble season winning for you guys was perfection.
Yeah.
If you could have perfection in terms of cross collaboration, where you could control the playing field in terms of true collaboration and innovation between public and private sector clients, how would you run that?
Wow, that is a question. I think you'd have to have some independence to the process. I think you would have to have something that brings those people together. So you've not got a player that's dominant in the relationship. It would have to have some kind of independence to make it happen. I think you would have to invest. You use the football analogy. I mean,
it pained me, by the way. It really pained me, Tony. That thing cilled me. I hope they cut that.
We're now watching average football. So,
I get that.
There you go. But the City had to invest to get a seat at that top table to then be able to perform. And again, these things won't happen. They won't happen without leadership. It won't happen without drive. As I say, there needs to be some independence of bringing these people together. Yeah.
Would that be both sides of the party?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you wouldn't have a dominant player.
Yeah.
People have to put their money where their mouths are.
Yeah.
In terms of a JV. And what else would you do?
You'd have to have some real star players, wouldn't you? Yeah. Somebody would have to kind of be the captain.
Yeah.
Show the lead. Yeah. Take that drive. I think when it comes to it, a lot of that kind of development that we're talking about happens through few people who have that drive. And if you haven't got them, you ain't going to get that either. But for me, I think this has to come from government.
Yeah,
it really does. And sadly, at the moment, don't get me wrong, I think there's a spirit of optimism that's not been in the sector for quite some time in terms of the new houses and the existing homes that need remediating. Different issue when it comes to cash.
Yeah.
But governments don't want to interfere in, local and regional structures, and of course devolutions. I mean, that's a possibility actually. If you look at the current arrangement in the West Midlands and same in Greater Manchester, devolution could be a game changer for us in this part of the world. The Mayor's office could start to drive greater collaboration, and I think in terms of our small part in that, we want to be knocking on the Mayor's door, talking about, well, hang on a minute, look, you're all about equality, you're all about diverse, opportunities. We ain't getting it looking.
Yeah.
How can we change that?
And with a change of government, what do you think are the top two challenges that we've got within the social housing property maintenance world in the next 2 years? What are the top two that?
I think we've got to get to a position where the buildings in which a lot of those residents live can be, with some confidence confirmed as safe for occupation. And we're still not there yet. There is a huge amount of work to be done around damp mould, around, fire safety and so on and so forth. I think, having a house that's kind of old and just needs remediating is very different to having a house that's not safe. I think that's a massive challenge, and again, there's just not enough cash around. You're seeing for the first time in a long, long time, balance sheets of housing associations really beginning to struggle because they've had to spend so much money on their existing stock, whilst also trying to build. So that's a big challenge for them. Second thing, I don't know. I worry about the sector, if I'm honest with you. In the same way that the education sector and the health sector became quite a beaten up sector. People only talk about their failures, not about the great things that they do. If we're not careful, we'll see the same with housing.
Yeah.
I understand there has to be a place for strong regulation and bringing people to book when it's just not good enough. But there needs to be some opportunity to learn from those mistakes as well. And culturally, at the moment, I'm not so sure that we're in a learning phase. Still think we're in a bit of a finger pointing phase where, as I say, we have to accept that we've not done well enough at times. But I'm seeing a number of senior colleagues leave the housing sector who just are not enjoying it anymore. And for a lot of them, it was a vocation. They genuinely believed in the mission and the pressure that comes with it now.
On a more light-hearted note, so my penultimate question is, obviously going from public to private, what's the top one or two things that have really impressed you that you've seen working in the private sector, where you thought, I didn't realise that this is what was, what had to be done? Obviously, you've spoke about the immobilisation, the 40 grand project to a 4 million. You've still got to do the same level of governance and work. What's the one or two things in terms of innovation have really impressed you?
Again, I can only really speak for the business that I work for. I'm bowled over by the ambition the family that own the business have when it comes to social value. They really do live the values. Their mission is to move into places, do what needs to be done and come back out, but in such a way that we leave those places in a better state than they were when we first kind of joined in. I think that's been incredibly impressive, and that's a big driver for me in terms of why I'm happy to work for the business. I think the quality of what we do as well. I know there's obviously other examples of poor quality, but the particular business that I work for, the business has worked very, very hard over many, many years to build a process that kind of works a bit like an engine, and you get a great outcome at the end of it. And I'm proud to be working for an organisation where your clerk of works is coming along and this is the best thing we've seen for a long, long time. I'm going to put you in for an award. We're not just about slap a bit of that on and
off we go.
See you again.
Well, you wouldn't be trading for over 100 years.
No.
And my last question, in terms of obviously transitioning from public to private sector, earlier in the conversation, which has been great, so thank you so much for coming down.
Thank you.
Is you've recommended to people listening to this, go and do different roles.
Yep.
within your organisation,
Yeah.
and all those organisations will 100% give them those opportunities
Yeah.
if they ask. Profit isn't a dirty word.
Yeah, absolutely.
What else? What one or two of the top tips would you give someone? Because not everyone's going to be an executive director at 34. But what are the top tips would you give someone who's, age is just a number, but working in public sector who wants look over there and go, you know what? If I go over to that side, I can do a good job and help our sector. What's your, final tips on that?
I mean, again, for me, it comes back to, we talked about people that need to have drive to make some of these things happen. There's nothing stopping one of those individuals from trying to create that collaborative platform that we've spoken about.
Yeah.
Within their own organisation. How about we invite these contractors in for, proper conversations about what are we doing right, what are we not doing right. So there's something about the individual just getting themselves immersed in that environment that's not necessarily about job shadowing or job placement. It's just about, getting involved in broader conversations. And for me, if I'm honest with you, knowing a lot of the people that I know on the housing side, give it a go.
Yeah.
Hopefully it works. If it doesn't work, you're interchangeable.
100%.
Is my view. And I think that's the other thing that, you've got to be a little bit more brave about, is just taking that leap of faith.
100% agree with you on that, because you don't know what you don't know.
No. I've been very surprised. I mean, I thought I would really struggle, and that's with my experience.
Wow.
And the broad roles that I've had over the years. I thought, I joke. I think I gave my managing director 3 opportunities to turn me down, and he didn't take any one of them.
Yeah.
So when we're having conversations now about, and how you're finding it, I'm finding it great.
Yeah. Really
challenging and exciting, and not as hard as I thought it would be. I thought I'd have to learn a completely different set of,
Brilliant. Tony, thank you so much for coming down. I hope to interview you again. We've got a few other ideas about other podcasts, but I hope this has been insightful for the guys who've been watching this. And thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.